On a slow day in late August, disaster struck a Los Angeles suburb. The image of the quiet California suburb under the clear, warm sky was set ablaze in total devastation as a passenger plane crashed into the homes of residents. Several homes were destroyed. Over 80 people were now dead. For those at the scene of the disaster, this already horrific day would take another devastating turn as the wreckage of a second plane was discovered just a few blocks away. This terrifying accident would bring into question the safety of our skies, especially around busy airports. The date was August 31st, 1986. In the United States, the end of summer is associated with the Labor Day holiday, celebrated over a long weekend. It was a quiet Sunday over the skies of Los Angeles. There weren't that many flights that day. One flight that was operating was Aeromexico Flight 498, from Tijuana to Los Angeles. Flight 498 originated in Mexico City and picked up more passengers on its journey northbound. At 11:20, Flight 498 departed Tijuana for the final leg to LAX. On board were 64 passengers and crew. 46-year-old Captain Arturo Valdez Prom was in command of the flight. With over 10,000 flight hours to his name, he was well acquainted with the Mexico City to Los Angeles route and very familiar with the airspace surrounding LAX. He was joined by a younger first officer who was flying the plane, 26-year-old Jose Hector Valencia. He had just under 1,500 total flight hours logged. Most of that time had been spent in the plane that the two men were flying that day, the Douglas DC-9. The Douglas DC-9 was an incredibly successful plane in its day. The twin-engine T-tail plane was a perfect fit for regional routes, and Aeromexico owned over a dozen of them in their fleet. The flight between Tijuana and LA is only a short one, with a cruising altitude of just 10,000 feet. After around 20 minutes in the air, the pilots of Flight 498 were already making preparations for landing, communicating with SoCal controllers. Flight 498 was flying close to the coastline to intercept their next waypoint at Seal Beach. The plane was to fly north from here in preparation for an easterly approach onto one of the two northern runways at LAX. The pilots were yet to communicate with controllers in Los Angeles. Although it was a quieter day than usual in the skies, the pilots were still required to follow the instructions of controllers. At 11:46, Flight 498 was handed off to Los Angeles Approach, where they contacted a new controller by the name of Walter White. White would have a rather brief conversation with the Aeromexico plane. He cleared the DC-9 to descend to 6,000 feet. The readback of this instruction from the Aeromexico plane would really be the only and last time you'd hear from them. As the Aeromexico approached Los Angeles, they entered a different classification of airspace. The region of airspace around LAX falls into a higher and stricter classification. Often known as a Terminal Control Area or TCA, this is a three-dimensional section of controlled airspace with various restrictions for aircraft, and it isn't just limited to a simple shape or radius around the airport. The accident report describes the LAX TCA as an upside-down wedding cake shape. The boundaries of the TCA are aligned with the runways and their extended centerlines. As one moves outward from the airport, the lateral size of airspace increases incrementally, with airspace of different classifications and therefore different rules surrounding it. The specific details of the TCA and its boundaries are all noted in the airport's charts, which every pilot that flies in and around this region should be familiar with. When we talk about Aeromexico 498, the conversation around the TCA can't really be complete without at least mentioning the disaster that preceded it 8 years previously. In 1978, a Boeing 727 crashed in San Diego due to a mid-air collision. Investigators and aviation authorities in the aftermath of that accident, along with knowledge built over further previous incidents, constructed new ways in which air traffic should be controlled. The Terminal Control Area was born, conceptualized as a way to keep pilots and passengers safe. A problem had reared itself in 1978, and there was a danger in the skies between commercial and general aviation planes, especially around large airports. If you would like to know more about the PSA disaster, consider watching our video on it. The thing is, you cannot just fly into the TCA if you are, say, a private pilot, for example. What elevates it above other surrounding airspace is that, in the case of LAX, it falls into Class B airspace, which means all flights are under the directions of air traffic control and must be identified on radar. This means for pilots of smaller planes, such as private pilots in general aviation, for example, who fly under visual flight rules, they must contact controllers ahead of time if they wish to enter the TCA. Permission to enter is not always granted. In fact, it is routine to even refuse entry into the TCA, so private pilots often plan their flights around this airspace to keep clear and not interfere with the approach and departing process of larger airports. But if a pilot like this wanted to, they must get clearance before they enter. The reason we bring up all this talk of airspace is because now we need to direct our attention to a completely different airport around 10 miles south of LAX, Torrance Zamparini Airport. Located in the suburban city of the same name, this is a general aviation airport popular with private pilots who own their own plane and even student pilots. For aviation enthusiasts in SoCal, Torrance has all the facilities for those smaller private planes. One individual who used to frequent the small airport here was a man by the name of William Kramer. Aged 53, Kramer worked in upper management at an engineering firm and had a passion for flying. He achieved his pilot's license and purchased a small Piper Cherokee that can seat up to 4 people. He'd often use the small plane for day trips and holidays for himself and his family, and the Labor Day weekend of 1986 was a perfect time to go flying. On that fateful day, August 31st, 1986, he, his wife, and their daughter had planned to fly from Torrance to Big Bear, around 90 miles to the east. Kramer was new to Los Angeles and only moved to the area the previous year from Washington State. As a new pilot in Los Angeles, he received familiarization training with the region, where he would have first encountered the Los Angeles TCA. Kramer's piloting skills were later described by others who flew with him as overtly careful. He was well aware of his low flight hours and made considerable effort to adhere to the rules of flying in this region, which is why for his flight between Torrance and Big Bear, he planned a route with the intention to stay clear of the TCA. Pretty normal. He planned a simple route under visual flight rules, direct to Long Beach, direct to the Paradise Vortex, and then direct to Big Bear. He planned an intended cruise altitude of 9,500 feet, but it's important to note that he was never actually required to reach this altitude at any point in the flight. So long as he kept mindful of his altitude, he would stay below the floor of the areas of the TCA that stretches south of LAX. Specifically to note, we should highlight this wedge of the TCA, as this is really the point of interest in this accident. This is where the disaster occurred. It is often used as an approach path for arriving planes into LAX. According to the chart for this section of airspace back in 1986, the floor of the TCA begins at 6,000 feet, with a ceiling of 7,000. Airspace around this was the less restricted airspace often used by pilots like William Kramer. Staying at a lower altitude, Kramer could pass under this airspace and stay out of the way, with no need to contact for permission to enter the TCA. So, did he stay out of the way? Well, ultimately, no, he didn't. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here. Let's look at his actual flight. At 11:41 on August 31st, 1986, William Kramer and his 2 passengers left Torrance and flew to Long Beach as expected, now continuing on to Paradise. Soon they'd reach that wedge of airspace. As already mentioned, to navigate through here, he needed to stay at a lower altitude. Around this time, the Aeromexico Flight was approaching from the south, descending to 6,000 feet, and was using that exact piece of the TCA. The 2 flight paths of the 2 planes were set to converge over the LA suburb of Cerritos. Aeromexico 498 was descending, whilst the Kramer's Cherokee was climbing. In the tower, controller Walter White was tracking the Aeromexico jet, however became distracted when another plane showed up on his radar and radioed in. Another small general aviation aircraft unrelated to the Cherokee we've already discussed had violated the terminal control area and had entered without permission. Investigators would later establish that Walter White would spend considerable time conversing with this aircraft. By the time he returned to the Aeromexico plane to give further instructions, disaster had already struck. Let's back up and understand what had actually happened. William Kramer, piloting his Cherokee, had entered the terminal control area without contacting controllers. Inadvertently, he climbed high enough to a point that when he reached this wedge of airspace, he crossed into the TCA boundary. He never identified himself on the radio, and the controller monitoring Walter White also did not notice the plane. In fact, the only radio contact between the Cherokee and the ground was had with the tower back at Torrance Airport. Once it left, it was never heard from again, which makes it incredibly difficult to say what was going on board that small plane. Such private planes aren't required to have any kind of flight recorder even today, let alone in 1986. Here is what we can say though. As a pilot who was flying visually, William Kramer was navigating by looking outside primarily for landmarks for navigation. It is possible that for a time, he was unaware of his presence in the airspace. As the Cherokee continued to climb, it reached 6,000 feet, and even continued to climb to the point it crossed directly into the path of Aeromexico 498. The collision occurred at just over 6,500 feet, well inside of the TCA. Here is the breakdown as to how the two planes hit. The Cherokee impacted the DC-9 side-on into the tail structure of the plane, specifically towards the top of the tail fin. The horizontal stabilizer sliced through the canopy of the Cherokee. In this moment, William Kramer, his wife, and their daughter, all three of them were decapitated. The force of the collision destroyed the DC-9's tail structure, tearing off most of the fin along with removing the horizontal stabilizers completely. This left the DC-9 uncontrollable. The aircraft entered a rapid descent, continuing into a dive, where it plummeted to the ground nose first. In the final moments of the ill-fated plane's final descent, this horrifying photograph was taken. In the image, you can see how the DC-9's tail was torn off. Seconds later, the plane crashed into the Cerritos suburb. Here is the region the DC-9 crashed. The plane impacted into several homes on Holmes Avenue, just off of Carmenita Road. That day being not only a Sunday but also a holiday, meant that most people were home at the time of disaster. Over a dozen homes were affected, some completely destroyed, multiple more were damaged. All 64 people on board Aeromexico 498 were killed. A further 15 people, residents of Cerritos, were killed in their homes. The wreckage of the Piper Cherokee crashed into the playground of an elementary school just a few blocks away. The remains of William Kramer and his family were discovered inside. In total, 82 people were now dead. From the very beginning, it was established that a mid-air collision had occurred. In terms of this specific case of a mid-air collision incident, what this effectively came down to was that the Aeromexico plane was exactly where it should have been. The Kramer's Cherokee wasn't. It had drifted into the TCA, into the path of the Aeromexico plane. The Cerritos disaster was just the latest case in a type of disaster that engineers and those in the aviation industry had been trying to prevent for so long. The Traffic Collision Avoidance System, or TCAS, which was somewhat new at the time, would continue to be developed and show up in more flight decks around the world. It audibly warns pilots of a potential traffic conflict and even gives an instruction that pilots are taught to follow. TCAS was present at the time in 1986. However, after this accident, the FAA made it mandatory for all commercial planes to be fitted with it, and that general aviation planes be fitted with a newer transponder that can broadcast altitude information to controllers. A newer transponder that does this was not present on William Kramer's Piper. The Traffic Collision Avoidance System has been crucial in preventing further mid-air collisions since. To answer an obvious question that one may have, could the pilots have been able to see each other? After all, it was a beautiful, clear day. The thing is, it is rather difficult to spot a plane at a distance when you yourself are flying, especially if you have duties that demand your attention be drawn away from looking outside. For the pilots of the Aeromexico plane, they would have been preparing for landing, running through checklists, configuring their plane, and without any notification of traffic from the controller, it's easy to arrive at the conclusion that they would not have been able to see the small Piper Cherokee converging on their position. As for the smaller plane itself, as we've already mentioned, it's really hard to say what was actually going on inside that plane. It didn't have a flight recorder and left no radio communications to work with. If I was to give my own opinion as someone who has done this sort of flying before, it is possible that Kramer had his hands full with navigation. He could easily, at that critical point, have been looking at a map, looking at his flight plan, looking at the ground, looking out for landmarks, maybe even looking at the freeways which are scattered about the landscape here. Regardless, he was doing anything but looking to his right, where the DC-9 was approaching. The final point to address when it comes to the Cerritos case, even though the Piper flew into airspace it shouldn't have, and maybe even the pilots of both planes weren't looking out for each other, that doesn't really explain why the controller never intervened. It is suggested that controller Walter White should have been able to see William Kramer's Cherokee on his radar. It may not have been identified, but the plane would have returned some form of radar data that would have been pinged, even if it was just a small blip on Walter White's radar. So, did he even see it? Well, it's perhaps not that simple. It should be noted that Los Angeles controllers had long complained about the state of the radar system. It had been known to malfunction, not work correctly, and even in some cases, fail to adequately display radar data of aircraft. Controllers at Los Angeles believe that the old age and poor state of the radar played a role in shrouding the Cherokee from view. Others disagree. When presented with recorded radar data, investigators were able to plot out exactly where the Cherokee went. Maybe the plane had its radar data temporarily interrupted, but it is the opinion of investigators that the plane should have still been in a position to be seen by controllers. Furthermore, if William Kramer's Piper Cherokee had been fitted with a newer transponder that broadcasts altitude information, it would have sent that to the relevant radar screens. Regardless, the accident clearly had an effect on Mr. White. Though for a time afterward he did try to get back on track as an air traffic controller, he eventually left the job and never worked as an air traffic controller again. Aeromexico 498 was the last time a commercial plane had been lost in the United States in a mid-air collision. Hello everyone, I hope you are doing well today. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and be subscribed, as there is always a new video every Saturday. This one was a long time coming. I actually learned a lot about the Los Angeles area making this video. Not just the airspace, but I gained knowledge of all the suburban towns beneath it. Maybe one day I'll get to visit California, who knows. Anyway, we'll actually be taking a look at a different mid-air collision in a couple of weeks' time, I think. Going to a completely different area of the world, taking on an accident that isn't actually that well known, even in my own country, which it kind of involves. Anyway, I shall end this video, but I'd like to take a moment to thank my amazing patrons over on Patreon for their amazing ongoing support. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you do see your name here, a massive thanks to you. Shout out this week to Luke Jensen, who pledged late last week. Thank you so much. If you yourself would like to support the channel further and even get your name featured here at the end of the next video, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all new content 2 days before it goes out publicly on YouTube. I think that's where we'll end things today. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you next week. Goodbye!